Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of Surprise Books. Summer is a great time to read books again. No one wants to hang around outside when it's too hot. Just find a shady place, a shade place, a cool place, and expand your mind, your consciousness with today Zen in the Art of Archery by the German philosopher Eugen Herrigel. He really visited Japan, hung around with the Zen intellectuals, came back to Nazi Germany, was in the Nazi party for a while, but afterwards, even the famous Zen propagandist Daisetsu Suzuki wrote a foreword and said, pretty good. He pretty well grasped the essence of Zen, how to train your mind, how to focus your mind. Okay, first the introduction by Daisetsu Suzuki. One of the most significant features we notice in the practice of archery, and in fact of all the arts as they are studied in Japan and probably also in other Far Eastern countries, is that they are not intended for utilitarian purposes only, or for purely aesthetic enjoyments, but are meant to train the mind. Indeed, to bring it into contact with the ultimate reality. Archery is therefore not practiced solely for hitting the target. The swordsman does not wield the sword just for the sake of outdoing his opponent. The dancer does not dance just to perform certain rhythmical movements of the body. The mind has first to be attuned to the unconscious. Tune in, like the psychedelic movement then later said. That's why Zen and psychedelic shamanistic philosophy goes well together. If one really wishes to be master of an art, technical knowledge of it is not enough. One has to transcend technique so that the art becomes an artless art, growing out of the unconscious, like automatically, naturally, without effort. In the case of archery, the hitter and the hit are no longer two opposing objects, but are one reality. The archer ceases to be conscious of himself as the one who is engaged in hitting the bull's eye, which confronts him. This state of unconsciousness is realized only when completely empty and rid of the self. He becomes one with the perfecting of his technical skill, though there is in it something of a quite different order which cannot be attained by any progressive study of the art. No intellectual study will bring you there. No. It's an intuition, it's a heart science. What differentiates Zen most characteristically from all other teachings, religious, philosophical, or mystical, is that while it never goes out of our daily life, yet with all its practicalness and concreteness, Zen has something in it which makes it stand aloof from the scene of worldly sordidness and restlessness, from material capitalism, maybe. Here we come to the connection between Zen and archery, and such other arts as swordsmanship, flower arrangement, the tea ceremony, dancing, and the fine arts. Zen is the everyday mind, as was proclaimed by Baso Matsu, died 788, great Zen monk. This everyday mind is no more than sleeping when tired, eating when hungry. As soon as we reflect, deliberate, and conceptualize, the original unconsciousness is lost and a thought interferes. We no longer eat while eating. We no longer sleep while sleeping. The arrow is off the string but does not fly straight to the target, nor does the target stand where it is. Calculation, which is miscalculation, sets in. The whole business of archery goes the wrong way. The archer's confused mind betrays itself in every direction and every field of activity. Man is a thinking reed, but his great works are done when he is not calculating and thinking. Childlikeness has to be restored with long years of training in the art of self forgetfulness. When this is attained, man thinks, yet he does not think. He thinks like the showers coming down from the sky. He thinks like the waves rolling on the ocean. He thinks like the stars illuminating the nightly heavens. He thinks like the green foliage shooting forth in the relaxing spring breeze. Indeed, he is the showers, the ocean, the stars, the foliage. Very mystical, Taoistic thinking. Yeah. When a man reaches this stage of spiritual development, he is a Zen artist of life. He does not need, like the painter, a canvas, brushes, and paints, nor does he require, like the archer, the bow and arrow and target and other paraphernalia. He has limbs, body, head, and other parts. His Zen life expresses itself by means of all these tools, which are important to its manifestation. His hands and feet are the brushes, and the whole universe is the canvas on which he depicts his life for 70, 80, or even 90 years. This picture is called history. Huyen of Gosozen, died 1140, says, "Here is a man who, turning the emptiness of space into a sheet of paper, the waves of the ocean into an inkwell, and Mount Sumeru into a brush, writes these 5 characters: So, Shi, Sai, Rai, I." Okay. Footnote: these 5 characters in Chinese, literally translated, mean the first patriarch's motive for coming from the West. First patriarch is Bodhidharma. The theme is often taken up as a subject of Mondo. It is Mondovisione. It is the same as asking about the most essential thing in Zen. When this is understood, Zen is this body itself. So it goes very into detail. We'll don't dive into that. To such I spread my zagu. Zagu is one of the articles carried by the Zen monk. It is spread before him when he bows to the Buddha or to the teacher. Okay. And make my profound bow. Okay, this is getting too complicated. Suzuki-san, who was a businessman, but became very rich with his Zen, explaining Zen books. One may well ask, what does this fantastic pronouncement mean? Why is a person who can perform such a feat considered worthy of the utmost respect? Zen master would perhaps answer, I eat when hungry, I sleep when tired. If he is nature minded, he may say, it was fine yesterday and today it is raining. For the reader, however, the question may still remain unsolved. Where is the archer? In this wonderful little book, Mr. Herrigel, a German philosopher who came to Japan and took up the practice of archery toward an understanding of Zen, gives an illuminating account of his own experience. Through his expression, the Western reader will find a more familiar manner of dealing with what very often must seem to be a strange and somewhat unapproachable Eastern experience. Okay. He wrote this in Massachusetts. Suzuki frequented the US. What was he doing there? Was he a spy? Zen in the Art of Archery. Chapter 1, I'll read. At first sight, it must seem intolerably degrading for Zen, however, the reader may understand this word, to be associated with anything so mundane as archery, even if he were willing to make a big concession and to find archery distinguished as an art. He would scarcely feel inclined to look behind this art for anything more than a decidedly sporting form of prowess. He therefore expects to be told something about the amazing feats of Japanese trick artists who have the advantage of being able to rely on a time honored and unbroken tradition in the use of bow and arrow. For in the Far East, it is only a few generations since the old means of combat were replaced by modern weapons, and familiarity in the handling of them by no means fell into disuse, but went on propagating itself, and has since been cultivated in ever widening circles. Might one not expect, therefore, a description of the special ways in which archery is is pursued today as a national sport in Japan? Nothing could be more mistaken than this expectation. By archery in the traditional sense, which he esteems as an art and honors as a national heritage, the Japanese does not understand the sport, but, strange as this may sound at first, a religious ritual, and consequently, by the art of archery, he does not mean the ability of the sportsman, which can be controlled more or less by bodily exercises, but an ability whose origin is to be sought in spiritual exercises and whose aim consists in hitting a spiritual goal, so that fundamentally the marksman aims at himself and may even succeed in hitting himself. This sounds puzzling, no doubt. What? The reader will say. Are we to believe that archery, once practiced for the contest of life and death, has not survived even as a sport, but has been degraded to a spiritual exercise? Of what use then are the bow and the arrow and target? Does not this deny the manly old art and honest meaning of archery and set up in its place something nebulous, if not positively fantastic? It must, however, be borne in mind that the peculiar spirit of this art, far from having to be infused back into the use of bow and arrow in recent times, was always essentially bound up with them and has emerged all the more forthrightly and convincingly now that it no longer has to prove itself in bloody contests. It is not true to say that the traditional technique of archery, since it is no longer of importance in fighting, has turned into a pleasant pastime and thereby been rendered innocuous. The great doctrine of archery tells us something very different. According to it, archery is still a matter of life and death, to the extent that it is a contest of the archer with himself. And this kind of contest is not a paltry substitute, but the foundation of all contests outwardly directed. For instance, with a bodily opponent. In this contest of the archer with himself is revealed the secret essence of this art, and instruction in it does not suppress anything essential by waiving the utilitarian ends to which the practice of knightly contests was put. Anyone who subscribes to this art today, therefore, will gain from its historical development the undeniable advantage of not being tempted to obscure his understanding of the great doctrine by practical aims, even though he hides them from himself, and to make it perhaps altogether impossible for access to the art. And the master archers of all times are agreed in this, is only granted to those who are pure in heart, untroubled by subsidiary aims. Should one ask from this standpoint how the Japanese masters understand this contest of the archer with himself and how they describe it, their answer would sound enigmatic in the extreme. For them, the contest consists in the archer aiming at himself, and yet not at himself in hitting himself, and yet not himself, and thus becoming simultaneously the aimer and the aim, the hitter and the hit, or to use some expressions which are nearest the heart of the masters, it is necessary for the archer to become, in spite of himself, an unmoved center. Then comes the supreme and ultimate miracle. Art becomes artless. Shooting becomes not shooting. A shooting without bow and arrow. The teacher becomes a pupil again, the master a beginner, the end a beginning, and the beginning perfection. For Orientals, these mysterious formulae are clear and familiar truths, but for us they are completely bewildering. We have, therefore, to go into this question more deeply. For some considerable time, it has been no secret, even to us Europeans, that the Japanese arts go back for their inner form to a common root, namely Buddhism. This is as true of the art of archery as of ink painting, of the art of theater, no less than this tea ceremony, the art of flower arrangement and swordsmanship. All of them presuppose a spiritual attitude, and each cultivates it in its own way, an attitude which, in its most exalted form, is characteristic of Buddhism and determines the nature of the priestly type of man. I do not mean Buddhism in the ordinary sense, nor am I concerned here with the decidedly speculative form of Buddhism, which, because of its allegedly accessible literature, is the only one we know in Europe and even claim to understand. I mean Dhyana Buddhism, which is known in Japan as Zen, and is not speculation at all, but immediate experience of what, as the bottomless ground of being, cannot be comprehended by intellectual means, and cannot be conceived or interpreted even after the most unequivocal and incontestable experiences. One knows it by not knowing it. Beautiful. One knows it by not knowing it. For the sake of those crucial experiences, Zen Buddhism has struck out on paths which, through methodical immersion in oneself, lead to one's becoming aware in the deepest ground of the soul of the unnameable groundlessness and qualitylessness, nay, more, to one's becoming one with it. And this with a respect to archery and expressed in very tentative, on that account possibly misleading language, means that the spiritual exercises, thanks to which alone the technique of archery becomes an art, and, if all goes well, perfects itself as the artless art, are mystical exercises, like psychedelic exercises, rituals. And accordingly, archery can in no circumstances mean accomplishing anything outwardly with bow and arrow, but only inwardly with oneself. So it's not really important if you hit the target or not. No, it's about conquering yourself, controlling, mastering yourself. Yeah. Bow and arrow are only a pretext for something that could just as well happen without them. Only the way to a goal, not the goal itself, only helps for the last decisive leap. In view of all this, nothing would be more desirable than that one should be able to lay hands on expositions by Zen Buddhists as an aid to understanding. These are, in fact, not lacking. In his essays in Zen Buddhism, D.T. Suzuki, you heard him in the introduction, has succeeded in showing that Japanese culture and Zen are intimately connected and that Japanese art, the spiritual attitude of the samurai, the Japanese way of life, the moral, aesthetic, and to a certain extent, even the intellectual life of the Japanese owe their peculiarities to this background of Zen and cannot be properly understood by anybody not acquainted with it. The exceedingly important work of Suzuki and the researches of other Japanese scholars have aroused widespread interest. It is generally admitted that Dhyana Buddhism, which was born in India and after undergoing profound changes reached full development in China, was called Chan Buddhism, to be finally adopted by Japan, where it is cultivated as a living tradition to this day, has disclosed unsuspected ways of existence which it is of the utmost importance for us to understand. Despite all the efforts of Zen experts, however, the insight afforded to us Europeans into the essence of Zen has remained exceedingly scanty, as though it resisted deeper penetration. After a few steps, one's groping intuition comes up against unsurmountable barriers. Wrapped in impenetrable darkness, Zen must seem the strangest riddle which the spiritual life of the East has ever devised. Insoluble and yet irresistibly attractive. The reason for this painful feeling of inaccessibility lies to some extent in the style of exposition that has hitherto been adopted for Zen. No reasonable person would expect the Zen adept to do more than hint at the experiences which have liberated and changed him, or to attempt to describe the unimaginable and ineffable truth by which he now lives. In this respect, Zen is akin to pure introspective mysticism. Correct. Unless we enter into mystic experiences by direct participation, we remain outside, turn and twist as we may. This law, which all genuine mysticism obeys, allows of no exceptions. It is no contradiction that there exists a plethora of Zen texts regarded as sacred. They have the peculiarity of disclosing their life giving meaning only to those who have shown themselves worthy of the crucial experiences and who can therefore extract from these texts confirmation of what they themselves already possess and are independently of them. To the inexperienced, on the other hand, they remain not only dumb, how could he ever be in a position to read between the lines, the allusions, but will infallibly lead him into the most hopeless spiritual confusion, even if he approaches them with wariness and selfless devotion. Like all mysticism, Zen can only be understood by one who is himself a mystic and is therefore not tempted to gain by underhand methods what the mystical experience withholds from him. Yet the man who is transformed by Zen and who has passed through the fire of truth leads far too convincing a life for it to be overlooked. So it is not asking too much if driven by a feeling of spiritual affinity and desirous of finding a way to the nameless power which can work such miracles. For the merely curious have no right to demand anything. We expect the Zen adept at least to describe the way that leads to the goal. No mystic and no student of Zen is, at first step, the man he can become through self perfection. How much has still to be conquered and left behind before he finally lights upon the truth? How often is he tormented on the way by the desolate feeling that he is attempting the impossible, and yet this impossible will one day have become possible and even self evident? Is there not room for the hope, then, that a careful description of this long and difficult road will allow us at least one thing to ask whether we wish to travel it? Such descriptions of the way and its stations are almost entirely lacking in Zen literature. This is partly due to the fact that the Zen adept has an insuperable objection to giving any kind of instructions for the happy life. He knows from personal experience that nobody can stay the course without conscientious guidance from a skilled teacher and without the help of a master. No less decisive, on the other hand, is the fact that his experiences, his conquests, and spiritual transformations, so long as they still remain his, must be conquered and transformed again and again until everything his is annihilated. Annihilation. Annihilated. Only in this way can he attain a basis for experiences which, as the all embracing truth, rouse him to a life that is no longer his everyday personal life. He lives, but what lives is no longer himself. From this standpoint, we can understand why the Zen adept shuns all talk of himself and his progress, not because he thinks it immodest to talk, but because he regards it as a betrayal of Zen. Even to make up his mind to say anything about Zen itself costs him grave heart searchings. He has before him the warning example of one of the greatest masters who, on being asked what Zen was, maintained an unmoving silence, as though he had not heard the question. How then could any adept feel tempted to render an account of what he has thrown away and no longer misses? In these circumstances, I should be shirking my responsibilities if I confine myself to a string of paradoxes and took refuge behind a barrage of high sounding words, for it was my intention to throw light on the nature of Zen as it affects one of the arts on which it has set its stamp. This light is certainly not illumination in the sense fundamental to Zen, but at least shows that there must be something behind the impenetrable walls of mist, something which, like summer lightning, heralds the distant storm. So understood, the art of archery is rather like a preparatory school of Zen, for it enables the beginner to gain a clearer view through the work of his own hands of events which are not in themselves intelligible. Objectively speaking, it would be entirely possible to make one's way to Zen from any one of the arts I have named. What did he name? Flower arrangement, ikebana, also shodo, that I also did, calligraphy. Then you have the tea ceremony, I can recommend. Gardening is also quite good. Landscape designing, you can also call it. Meditation, sitting meditation, walking meditation. What do we else have? Reading, a little difficult. Painting, yeah, painting. You could also painting very similar to the calligraphy in Japanese arts. Did I forget anything? Wood cutting, sculpture, and gardening with the bonsai trees. You also try to create a sculpture. Okay, almost finished. However, I think I can achieve my aim most effectively by describing the course which a pupil of the art of archery has to complete. Haiku writing is also good as a discipline, a Zen discipline. Generally, short stories, poems. Okay. To be more precise, I'll start again. However, I think I can achieve my aim most effectively by describing the course which a pupil of the art of archery has to complete. To be more precise, I shall try to summarize the 6-year course, not bad, of instruction I received from one of the greatest masters of this art during my stay in Japan. So it is my own experiences which authorize me in this undertaking. In order to make myself intelligible at all, for even this preparatory school holds riddles enough, I have no alternative but to recollect in detail all the resistances I had to overcome, all the inhibitions I had to fight down before I succeeded in penetrating into the spirit of the great doctrine. Of course, all the martial arts, judo, karate, aikido, it's also very good for training Zen. I speak about myself only because I see no other way of reaching the goal I have set before me. For the same reason, I shall confine my account to essentials so as to make them stand out more clearly. I consciously refrain from describing the setting in which the instruction took place, from conjuring up scenes that have fixed themselves in my memory, and above all, from sketching a picture of the master, however tempting all this may be. Everything must hinge on the art of archery, which I sometimes feel is even more difficult to expound than to learn. And the exposition must be carried to the point where we begin to discern those far off horizons behind which Zen lives and breathes. Okay, read this book, buy this book. Zen and the Art of Archery. Thank you for listening.